All right, welcome back to the Nexus podcast. I'm super excited to have Danielle Jablanski as my guest today. Danielle is an industrial control system strategist and subject matter expert at CISA. We're going to talk all things critical infrastructure protection today. Danielle, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, has an impressive resume, including a position as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she contributes to the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. She was also an OT cybersecurity strategist at Nozomi Networks, and she has made long-lasting contributions to the OT cybersecurity field in a relatively short amount of time. So I'm very happy she's here. How you doing, Danielle?
I'm well, thanks, Mike, and the rest of your team for having me on today. I should mention that you might hear some dogs. I didn't mention that before we hit record, but I have two wild animals who moonlight as domesticated pets here. So,
well, my dog has made many appearances in the background, so it's all good. Some inadvertent barking. So how's things going? I know we were just talking about me being a journalist and coming over to the vendor side. Everybody was telling me, oh, you're going over to the dark side as a vendor. And did you get any comments on that going from kind of the vendor to the government side?
No, I think most people actually kind of expected me to go to government, probably not so quickly from private sector. I'm not sure if you know my background. I started as an analyst in the nuclear weapons space. So I kind of always have seen myself as an analyst. And when I got here, I do interviews across the country with different asset owners across all these different sectors. So not just ones that I focused on in the private sector. So I've gotten to do some of that interview style analyst work that I used to do, but coming from the government and saying, hey, what do you want? What's working? What's not working? What's hard? What's too expensive? Those kinds of questions. So it's been really fun.
Well, let's just jump right in. And I know, I mentioned in the introduction, we want to talk about critical infrastructure protection. The thing that always stands out to me, and I always like to ask folks like yourself, there's so much private ownership within the critical infrastructure sectors of these private companies, privately owned, that run so much CI within the United States in particular. How complicated is it to, from a government perspective, provide oversight, provide guidance, given the private aspect of this?
It's incredibly challenging. People sometimes think that the government is going to be there to rush in, right, in any given situation. And of course, we would love to do that, but we can't be everywhere all the time. This is, of course, the same argument with policing cyberspace globally, right? So you'll hear InfraGard make the same kind of argument, as well as, all the way up to some of the global info sharing. They can't be everywhere all the time. Interpol, right? So that's the other kind of extension of that. So private ownership is obviously predominant. There actually a couple of years ago, there was some academic research that published about how many water utilities were privately owned versus publicly. The difference, though, is in the customers they serve, right? So even though there are potentially fewer private in the water industry, they serve more customers. In the energy space, it's different. So a lot of these models, they're still not ubiquitous models, right? So you have to really drill into each and every sector to understand the nuance. However, at CISA, our services are still offered for free to these owners and operators, regardless of the ownership model. And so that sometimes really impacts who owns the risk, but not always at these organizations. And of course, this is not a regulator. I will share that asset owners have actually asked us for more regulation, which is ironic, for themselves, for suppliers, as well as integrators, because they want more specifics. So I think the problem isn't necessarily an ownership issue, but there are too many frames of reference out there now. Folks are inundated with intelligence. They're inundated with information. There are competing strategies and tool sets. There's lack of common vernacular goals and outcomes, lack of clear implementation guidance. And of course, the government can help on that latter format, the implementation guidance. But this has more to do with generally tackling OT and ICS issues and distribution issues of actual operations than it does the ownership model, if that matters, or if that makes sense. And then it comes down to cost and affordability, but that's not always the case. I've actually seen some operations where their distributed architectures and distributed risk is actually seen as a security control, where each plant or factory has its own security policy, procedures, and response plans. And so they actually see that lack of centralization as a security barrier. I have no opinion on that, but it kind of goes back to the days of like complexity, security through obscurity. And so there's a lot of that government can do in that space, but the ownership models, in my opinion, doesn't matter as much as kind of the distributed nature and really who owns the risk, which I think still continues to be volleyed around.
Yeah. It's a couple of interesting points there around wanting more regulations and the distributed aspect of it being a control. Are those engineers talking and asset owners, or are they quote unquote security folks?
I spoke specifically to security practitioners that owned OT risk
Okay.
across all the cyber physical segments. So
Yeah.
not financial, not banks, but I spoke to
Hmm.
dams, food and agriculture, water, electricity, pipelines, transportation, ports, airports. Most of the folks that you would think of in that space. And of course, there's a lot the government can do and endorse. But like I mentioned, this is not a regulator, so we're not looking towards more regulation. What we can do is think about scalability, how to better understand supply chains, because you always hear the phrase boiling the ocean, and that's still going to be true when you look at your supply chain. How do you break that down, understand the nuance, and do some of that criticality mapping that we talk about in OT systems all the time, or OT networks and environments? How do we do that across the full supply chain? And then how do we look at global standards and best practices? So of course the community always references 6443. However, the
Hmm.
U.S. government is not typically going to point to something that's behind a paywall because we want scalability, like I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of trade-offs. But we're really closely watching things like NIS2 and the CRA Act in Europe, not because we want to follow along, but because we want to see what some of the pitfalls are there in some of the curated policy around these really, really subjective processes that run the world around us. And
Sure.
instead, we're investing in, of course, the CPGs that you've heard about before, but also enhancing some of our services around validated architecture design review, incident response, and pen testing. And so while we're, have this global, how is this going to play out elsewhere approach, we're also heavily investing in expanding some of our products and services to meet the needs of ICS stakeholders, not everywhere all
Hmm.
the time, like I mentioned, but, to the best of our ability.
Yeah. It's interesting. It always seems like maybe Europe isn't leading the way, but certainly they're out and get out there first with on the regulatory front, and with NIS2 and CRA is just kind of the latest forays in that respect.
Yeah. Um, I don't do a lot of comparative work on standards and policies anymore, but I
Yeah.
really do think it's more of a vernacular and awareness issue in the U.S. Europe has a little bit easier of a time scoping, what sectors matter per state.
Mm.
We have a much more difficult job here categorizing our risk and cascading failures across the sectors, how they rely on each other and within those sectors, right? So
Mm.
intra transactions as well as interactions across the
Right.
sectors. It's actually part of my background in some of the research I've done at the Atlantic Council, but it's much more difficult to wrap around in the U.S. I think.
Yeah. Did the the requests for more regulations and more guidance, do you see that as an offshoot of just kind of like needing more resources, more expertise, more funding?
I
Um,
do. I see it as a cost center problem.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the issues we have is we have to make sure that there are security champions within any organization, regardless of its makeup. And that champion then has to go prove their point. And we've seen presentations in security of, if a tree fell in the woods and nobody heard it, I've given that talk,
Yeah.
right? It's the same argument actually with, counterterrorism in the US. If something didn't happen and I have to provide details, but I can only provide so few details that you're allowed to know and privy to um, about something that didn't happen, then how do I convince somebody to invest in that?
Right.
It's kind of difficult. And especially for OT, when we then continue to say, hey, 90%, 99% are going to be IT issues, are going to be network issues, are going to be living off the land issues. But we want you to invest heavily in OT because it has safety impacts, environmental impacts.
Hmm.
Easiest way I break this down for people is, hey, have you ever had carbon monoxide poisoning?
Right.
Just no. You
You
have
only
an
get one
alert.
shot at that usually.
Exactly. Do you have an alarm system in your home or, with your children, with your family, with your pets, in case you ever have the potential to be poisoned by carbon monoxide? The answer is always
Hmm.
yes.
Right.
It's the easiest kind of example. Of course, it's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's not when you talk about some of the safety, considerations we have for different environments here.
Hmm. How do you characterize the gap between the so-called haves and have-nots? I mean, you brought up the small water utility. That's always kind of like the first example, the first anecdote that people bring up. But I would imagine the gap is pretty significant in terms of expertise, again, resources.
Yeah, there is a gap, but ironically, the things that OT and IT folks struggle, and even those that are now wearing the OT hat, right, that come over from OT or IT, we call this the convergence topic. I hate that word. I've always hated that word. But I mentioned these interviews that I've done. Asset owners are still struggling. Things that will not surprise you. It's not AI implementation in OT. It's not post quantum encryption, right? It's asset inventory, cloud adoption, and third party risk. And those are things that everyone can really comprehend, right? You don't have to be able to, understand variables and set points in an industrial control system to talk about those three categories. So I think there are ways to discuss the main issues that get back to the predominant, tasks of securing networks, and reducing the severity of overall impacts to your environment that everyone can get on board with. And I think that's what's kind of missing. We get a little too in the weeds sometimes, or we talk too high level and we're missing the mark. Especially when we talk about third-party risk. I mean, I think this is a huge topic across every asset owner I've spoken to, because they're now weighing the consolidation of their ecosystem versus single points of failure with things like having three cloud providers, right? If they're looking at, enterprise to OT data analysis or ERP, then they're also looking at best-in-class requirements when it comes to security solutions and suites of solutions and partnerships. And it's really sometimes a gamble, but it's also that could be somebody's entire job, right?
Mm.
If you have one person tasked with, in an airport, everything from email security to physical security with some of your meters or your parking infrastructure, as well as your baggage claim, as well as, the control and flow of people and aircrafts, right? If they're the full facility kind of OT IT manager, they can't even conceive of all the third party risk that they need to, tackle day in and day out. So how do we help with that, right? OT is just a part of that.
And in terms of supply chain third-party risks, are there specifics that they're really pointing out when you have these conversations? Is it just kind of like lack of visibility into what the partner's security posture is, or too much access to the environment? What are some of the specific risks they're concerned about?
So there's a categorization issue where they haven't done like that crown jewel analysis that we talk about a lot in OT across their third-party environment. There are, of course, checklists for validating when they, incorporate and adopt new technologies. But those checklists sometimes break down during an incident. So then they have to go and investigate if a third party has been compromised. Does that then cascade into my environment? What does that mean for me? So there's the extreme example of like SolarWinds, obviously. And then there are much more manageable, incidents that happen that can be taken care of. But again, that could take an entire full-time employee to just kind of round that out. I spoke with one asset owner that had 100 third-party incidents within their ecosystem that were not direct, incidents at their organization, but that they had to deal with. That was a major company, so they had the resources, but that doesn't mean that it's not intensive. So when we talk about building programs, building policies, building procedures, how do you do that if so much of your time is focused on this third-party consequence, And then the best in class that I mentioned is we're starting to see some asset owners say, well, I've always worked with this IT company. They now offer something in OT. I don't know how to scrutinize that. Can you help me? And the government obviously is not going to put weight behind any specific solution. But then you also see suppliers in the OT infrastructure saying, we only support implementation with this one security solution, even though that might not be the only implementation across your environment. So there's this dual concern now with the IT and OT of, do I extend my IT security solutions to OT? If so, how much, do they understand in that domain? How much authority do they have over making decisions or reporting events and incidents in that domain? And then if not, how do I choose best in class horizontal solutions if my infrastructure only supports a handful of these, right? So that's why I put it as consolidation versus single points of failure, because that's really what the risk conversation has to come down to.
Right. Next question is just kind of, I think it's related to the private ownership, but just, is there anything that government can do from a public policy standpoint around critical infrastructure protection that can be enforced? I mean, it's kind of like, obviously the government is never prescriptive.
Right. So like I said before, we specifically at CISA, I can't speak for, we're not a regulator and I can't speak on behalf of the entire government, but I really do think scalability is the name of the game here. And that's why I did mention some of NIST too. Again, not to just point to Europe and say, let's follow their lead, but they actually did propose the concept of proportionality in NIST too. And it's something that doesn't get talked about enough. And I think proportionality is huge. When I was doing a lot of my research for the Atlantic Council, we kept talking about how with bulk energy systems, it's really easy to say, hey, taking out a bulk energy system in this one location in the US in this part of the power grid will have this impact on this number of people. That does not translate to other sectors in the US. So when we talk about solutions or even compliance or regulation, whatever hat you want to put on it, we have to be able to say that we understand the implications at a rural hospital versus a hospital in Atlanta that was part of their city infrastructure that was targeted, because that response capacity is going to be completely different. And so when we talk about proportionality in the NIS2 legislation, that's something we're going to have to look at in terms of any future regulation here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not shocked that industry, and by industry I mean the actual asset owners, are requesting more regulation, because they do want specifics. They want, hey, I now know I must incorporate, again, to rely on the energy sector, internal network security monitoring, because XYZ, and this is how I implement that solution. Does that then provide overall security all the time, everywhere? No. Is it a very easy articulated goal with a suite of solutions that I know how to implement? Yes. And I think the rest of the sectors really want to get to a place where they're not copying and pasting NERC SIP, but they have that understanding of, this is not a knee-jerk reaction. It's actually an implementation that I know, based on the populations impacted by these threats, are now protected due to me taking this control and implementing it correctly. And I think that's kind of the mistake. So it doesn't matter, again, if it's regulation or compliance or standards or best practices or methodologies, right? That's where we need to get to.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're talking about this from a relatively high level, but this sounds just so complex and complicated, the more granular you get. And I just can't imagine the position some of these folks are in, just trying to deal with all of this from so many different directions. It's funny too. I had a conversation with Joe Slowick at RSA. We did a podcast, and he was talking about, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, but just how, not everything can be critical, but everybody expects the same kind of response, whether it's government or from security research industry, et cetera. But it was just a really kind of, his point was, maybe there need to be some frank discussions that, maybe the small water utility just has to understand it's not as critical as, it's critical within the community, but on a bigger picture, on a larger scale, it's just harder to kind of allocate as much but as much resources and attention during an incident. So yeah, I don't know if you've ever talked to Joe about this or if you heard about his session, but I thought it was pretty interesting. Just kind of some difficult discussions.
Of course, I have a huge respect for him, not just because we're friends, but because he's a dominant force in this industry. A mentor of mine, of course, a number of years ago. We have. I didn't expect to, but I'm going to draw back on my nuclear background again. We do impact analysis, right? It's called blast radius. And yes, of course, there's a different blast radius if we're talking about a small utility, even where I live in northern Texas. I'm not in downtown Dallas. I'm in a suburb. I have a co-op, shout out, that provides my electricity. And yeah, the blast radius, if that co-op were to not be able to provide electricity, is much smaller than another comparison. That doesn't mean that those people that might be impacted don't matter. And that's when it comes back to, again, that local response capacity and that local response that goes to state and local, territorial, tribal. We've actually seen a lot of tribal incidents recently. There's been some public reporting on that. Again, that doesn't mean that we don't want to talk to them. There's actually a broader need here that I'm trying to focus and underline and underscore at the federal level, which is we need to get out of DC and talk to these folks and just see, hey, what's going to help the most? It's not going to be pen testing always, right? And we don't have the capacity to pen test every small utility out there. But if 500 owners and operators say we need guidance on EDR implementation, then we can take that back and say, hey, here's a bulk need on implementation guidance, and CISA puts out mitigations all the time. Let's drill in on this guidance that is required across the board. Or hey, one that we did publish recently. So Secure by Demand for operational technology, working with the OEMs to say, hey, when you're purchasing and procuring new technologies or doing upgrades or greenfield, here are some of the things to consider with your providers that they're going to be able to provide if you demand it. Here's the conversation to have. Here are the key caveats in that conversation. That's something that everyone benefits from. That doesn't matter what your blast radius is in terms of an incident, right? So that's really what the federal government has to focus on.
Right. And do asset owners know to be vocal about that and come to you guys? I mean, I know there are channels available to them, but do they know they can do that? I guess
that's a great question. So CISA has actually been investing in customer research a ton in the last couple of years. We have a bunch of CX folks throughout the cybersecurity division, and they're looking at exactly this. How do you receive and understand who CISA is, what we provide, and where we are. Typically, it's in person through our CSAs in the field, cybersecurity advisors, and or at conferences. But you and I know that the small to medium-sized businesses, the integrators, the engineering firms out there, they're not coming to security conferences. So CISA now is looking at how do we get out there and get in front of, more SCADA tech, more ManuSec, more of these people that are, Distributech is another one, which of course is energy heavy, but how do we get in front of the owner and operators and their integrators and say, hey, we are interested in peer sharing. What are your challenges? What are your win wires or win themes, as the marketing teams like to call them, right? What's gone well, what's not gone well, and what do you need? And that's going to happen privately, of course. We're not going to pat ourselves on the back publicly or do a workshop, right, where we're talking on stage at RSA about it. But that's really what we need to see more of, I think, to be able to communicate the right needs across the country to our headquarters in DC.
Just to shift a little bit, just given the threats that have been made public anyway, how badly does OT, critical infrastructure owners and operators, how badly do they need or want government oversight right now? I mean, what do you think that might look like?
Yeah, so oversight isn't really the word I would use just from my own vantage point here. We see kind of partnerships like peer sharing, like I mentioned as an example of a partnership, direction, like the implementation guidance that I mentioned, and then enablement. So instead of oversight, I would use like one of those three or all three of those. We have a responsibility, obviously, to offer effective products and services. We are a service provider. But again, I've mentioned this like 3 times now. We cannot be a managed service provider to this full scope. But that also means that we have a responsibility to increase awareness. You've heard that before. Marketing teams have heard that before. Everyone's heard that before. But what I've started to underscore here is we also need aptitude. So if we have broad awareness, that's great. But if we don't provide the aptitude along with that for understanding risk in the space and applying those mitigations, then we're not doing our full job. And what I mean by that, as an example, is, of course, we can put out, hey, have an incident response plan. Hey, here are the subcategories for your incident response plan considering OT. But we need to go a step further and say, here are the forensic capacities you require if you can't read this 500-page SANS paper to actually have an effective incident response. And so we have to kind of go the extra mile. And I think beyond admiring the problem, we need to start enabling asset owners to successfully build their own security programs, policies, and procedures that really tackle this risk within their operational context in mind. And I think this is where some of the solutions fall short, is demonstrating that they can actually provide that operational context and not just some of the general vulnerabilities, the general, CISA scores, the general security provisions. And of course, solutions like Clarity have done a ton along the lines of enablement, but typically that enablement is either awareness or product enablement. And sometimes, time is money. I know that you guys, and Zomi used to as well, spend a lot of time with your customers to do enablement that is all sorts of different things, right? Looking at segmentation, looking at some of their maturity scope, looking at whether or not, they've actually captured the CPGs. I used to do that. And so there's all these other opportunities for enablement. And I think that we at CISA are also looking at how do we provide enablement beyond admiring the problem and raising awareness.
Just some kind of general industry questions before we sign off. Just kind of your take on the whole CVE situation. I mean, we've got 10, 11 months of runway now before we have to kind of deal with this again. I know CISA had a statement on this, but was this kind of a wake-up call that folks needed, or it seemed to come out of nowhere, at least from where I was sitting? But
it did not come out of nowhere for us. I'm known for being a little snarky, but on this one, you have 2 options. Like, you can either be annoyed at some of the hyperbole, or you can appreciate the concern. And I choose to appreciate the concern, to be honest with you. Before I came here, CVE was obviously instrumental to the security ecosystem that you and I both, have been in for years. I think that the contract timeline drama was seemingly really high stakes, but in reality, at CISA, our leadership throughout this transition has been consistently committed to due diligence in the face of many proposed administrative changes. And I think anyone, private sector or public sector, can really respect that they've maintained that due diligence. So in other words, there are a lot of checks and balances here that have to happen before contracts can be renewed. We have procurement specialists for a reason, and I'm not one of them. And so, we've remained committed to consistently assuring the community that we're going to be shepherding and spearheading CVE, and it's not going anywhere. And so I think, any published concern for potentially dismantling that program, I appreciate the concern. But I think we've tackled it. So again, a lot of respect for the process. With any type of leadership, we want to maintain that chain of command and making sure that we're doing things
For
right.
sure.
And even us, it was a nail biter. We were, it wasn't just the public that was waiting. We were sitting,
Yeah.
and there was a couple people that were instrumental in, working overtime to make that happen. So we have to remember that it's still people at the end of the day. It's not just a contract. It's not just a timeline. There are people committed to that. So again, I just appreciate the concern, even though I'm known for being a little bit more snarky than that. This is not one of those situations.
Right. It was an interesting day on social media that day, though. Everybody was like, what?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you've got groups like the Typhoons that don't worry about vulnerabilities. They're just kind of living off the land and bringing that perspective on this. Just what do you think of the messaging around that? It was a lot of alarmist messaging, and it was kind of hard to, siphon out the FUD from the reality on that.
Here I will be a little snarky. I think it's alarming that network security is consistently overlooked in the favor of shiny objects and like everything AI. Network security is really the baseline. So whether it's Volt Typhoon activity or Salt Typhoon activity, of course we put out mitigations that can hopefully have the most efficacy across the most environments, which is a difficulty we've already talked about in terms of all the sectors that we try to serve more specifically. But most of the incidents we do see begin by targeting poor hygiene, whether that's an accessible or insecure device or a network security gap. And we've published a ton of alerts on this. So, the PRC state-sponsored actors establishing persistent access to U.S. critical infrastructure in February. The words in that alert say actors are seeking to pre-position themselves on IT networks, and then goes on to discuss the potential impacts that might have to an OT environment. Well, those words were not chosen, again, by accident. We are humans. Right. CISA, who are witnessing things happen. I don't know if you remember the ODNI fact sheet or graphic that was put out, I think in June of 2024, and it had 29 Cyber Avengers attacks and 7 pro-Russia hacktivist attacks on it that were targeting pretty unsophisticated TTPs, but hitting a lot of critical infrastructure across the board. And so that we continue to publish mitigations because we still see these incidents, and people are saying, well, nothing's new here. And we're saying, lovely. So please take our advice. And again, it's not accidental wording. And, I'll touch on another thing, which is when things are highly tailored, like in Controller or Pipedream, everyone wants the IOCs for that. But like you just mentioned, like living off the land is one thing. But then when you really get into the crux of an OT system or a specialized SCADA, purpose-built, right? We have all these words for these systems. That built-in native functionality, that functionality being utilized as a legitimate user, when the security breach is still the ability to access that system, right? So how many people really need to know the set point changes, the value tags, the variables in the, that are being reported for that process if it's extremely tailored, when the security incident is still the ability to access those systems? So that brings us back to network security, credential access and management, and better hygiene. So yes, the basics are boring, but if you've ever met me before, I have always said security should be boring. I should make t-shirts, I should make stickers, right? Like I've always said that. And I know nobody's rooting for another in controller, or I guess that actually wasn't operationalized. So, it was a lucky catch, but, no one's rooting for a live in controller or, the next major cyber physical hack. But then our eyes kind of glaze over at these general mitigations. And it's like, well, wait a minute. All security programs and all security responsibility boils down to, reducing the severity of impacts, like I already said, which means reducing dwell time. And there are all these statistics out there about how quickly vulnerabilities are exploited and how, how long actors do dwell in environments. And so those are still the things we need to focus on. So these mitigations, while they do seem mundane, they are the hygiene requirements that we're continuing to see exploited, overlooked, or ignored, back to some of that ODNI reporting that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I forget who the first person to tell me this was, but there's very few of us that where 0 day should be on our threat model, or sophisticated spyware, or you name it. I mean, it comes down to lousy passwords and just basic security hygiene.
Yeah, it does. And that's why I always kind of harp on that severity of impacts, right? Because this gets back to who owns the risk. So I'll tie it back to our first question when we talked about the ownership models. Well, the ownership model doesn't matter. Who owns your risk matters. And there's a lot of assumptions in that, a lot of finger pointing. Oh, we've got insurance, or, it's the CISO that owns this, or no, it's the operators, or no, we have so many mergers and acquisitions that it's each facility. That doesn't work anymore. Everyone has a responsibility to reduce the severity of those impacts. And so that might mean reducing lateral movement in one case. It might mean, replacing hard-coded passwords. It depends on your crown jewel analysis that we've talked about. It depends on
Mm-hmm.
the threat models that we said. It depends on, the nature of your process and what we're protecting. So kind of back to that blast radius, you were talking entity level, but you have to do systems level blast radius as well. And that goes back to our supply chain discussion too. So it's really all interrelated. It is complex, but it's not impossible, right? We are all working towards continuous improvement, and you have to be, right? Static security is never going to reduce your dwell time. It's never going to reduce the severity of impact.
Mm-hmm. We should mention too that CISA published some guidance this week on OT mitigations. We're recording this on May 8th, so it was really. I liked it that it was focused a lot on basic security hygiene as we're talking about, but just like what are some of the conditions that prompted these specific mitigations for you guys when it came to that publications? I mean, just a little bit of everything we've been talking about, I suppose.
Yeah, mostly what we've been talking about so far. So some of the reporting that ODNI has put out, I know that specific graphic covers only November 2023 through April 2024, but we're consistently seeing the same TTPs that we have outlined before. We're seeing TTPs from 2022, like you mentioned. 0 days aren't part of a ton of risk matrix. I hate some of the statistics that go into that because I don't think cybersecurity is mathematical. I think it's categorical. And so, of course, we need to be thinking about those novel exploits. But today, what we're seeing most of is some of the known, right? When we talk about some of the baselines, how you train some of the products out there, we're talking about the known, right? Things that should be a part of your signature recognition, some of the TTPs we've seen before, and some of those glaring risks like we've seen, internet connected devices, hard-coded passwords, credential sharing, which is one we don't really talk about, but it goes into credential access. And then again, just to tie it back to your first question, like that ownership model, I think there's this bigger issue of diffusion of responsibility. So again, I've mentioned false assumptions and pointing the finger, but we're all familiar with the bystander effect during a potential emergency. But without an active emergency, I think there's also a tendency to divide this responsibility because it's so complex. Awareness is growing for OT and ICS or cyber physical risk, but there's this natural assumption that some other department or some other mechanism is going to solve for it. And we know that every security or program can't rely on those false assumptions. They can't rely on risk transfer when there is an actual emergency. And lastly, they can't buy their way out of these risks. I think that's what it really comes down to is, we're talking about easy kind of hygiene things, but they're not easy if you really look into them. Something that I've been picking on recently is how often we just say, network segmentation is a control. Well, it's not a light switch. You don't turn on network segmentation. And it is not something that happens overnight. There's actually, I mentioned before, and some of that inundation of best practices and guidance, there's actually many frames of reference for how you would do network segmentation. There's many different tools you could choose to implement. There's many different ways you could go about it. Even 6443 zones and conduits talks about what you could do, different scoping for that. You could do an entire process on one network. You could do it based on the devices. You can do it based on location, and you can also do it based on like credential access. You can segment entire systems based on who can operate them. That's not something that is a flip of a switch. And so we need to start really drilling in on some of those things. So of course we put out this mitigation because we want it to have a shelf life, and that mitigation is going to say you need to do proper network segmentation. And if somebody reads that and says, yeah, okay, we know that, and they're not going back to their networks and saying, well, wait a minute, what do our firewall rules look like? Have we looked at these recent IOCs? Do we know that our signature-based products are picking up these IP addresses or not? Some of that due diligence is also on these asset owners to be peeling back some of the the layers and saying, hey, let's look under the hood for a minute and see if we're actually meeting the needs that we have for these mitigations that we consider to be really generic. Because I think a lot of them would be surprised.
Yeah, that's the wake up call.
Yeah. Review your firewall. Wake up call for us.
How are OT and IT folks doing with their cultural issues around cybersecurity? That always seemed to be an area where they butted heads, but it seems like the convergence word is forcing them together on a lot of fronts. So just curious on your take on that.
Word. It's weird because we say convergence, which means one thing, but I think, and I might be wrong, I'm just one person, but I think as practitioners, we perceive it as an eclipse, right? Where like IT's taking over OT somehow, or it's like a bleeding edge. And so I don't like talking about it that way. I've only ever witnessed interoperability be an opportunity for success or for negligence when it comes to security. And I'll actually go back to some of the conversation around third-party risk, right? Cloud adoption is huge because you might be considering cloud adoption for an enterprise business case, and you might need some of the data that's going to hopefully traverse a DMZ in your properly segmented network, right?
Mm.
Based on your process. And that's one implementation of cloud. But then you also have security solutions that are going to be cloud first. You have to consider that, right? Interoperability, again, that has to be connected to other systems, speaking different protocols and understanding and digesting parts of your complex ecosystem in certain ways. And then you have some OEMs, looking at cloud adoption within those lower levels of the Purdue model, of course, along the lines of OT or SCADA in the cloud.
Yeah.
All very different, conversations, but all relying on interoperability. And again, an opportunity for success or negligence. Are you going to design security into that, whether that's procurement language design, whether that's network security, whether that's credential access, whether that's making sure when you are doing your site acceptance test that you don't have connectivity, remote access that you shouldn't have, working with those vendors in those ways to actually do that up front? Or is it an opportunity for negligence when you're overlooking those things, not building them into the POCs, not building them into the RFIs? I think it's all about interoperability and whether or not you're seeing it as an opportunity for success or kicking it down the line, down the curve.
Right. All right. So final question, just to kind of put you on the spot. Are you optimistic about critical infrastructure protection right now? Are we doing a better job than we were, say, 2 years ago or whatever time period makes sense?
I am optimistic, and not even from my government perspective, but two answers. So from my government perspective, I've actually seen just in the last year being here more interagency, like putting our heads together, brainstorming and execution on OT and cyber physical than I thought was here prior, and that I'd seen publicly beforehand, if that makes sense. And then within the actual community, I was a market analyst for a number of years as well. And like 2023 was kind of like a cooling off period on like the OT hype cycle, right? Like we didn't have the Gartner Magic Quadrant yet. And, we were all talking about whether or not the continuous monitoring companies were going to get bought up, acquired, or, I don't think anyone was really talking IPO, but there was this weird like lull. And
Sure.
now in the last year, I miss one S4 on maternity leave, and all of a sudden, we have a bunch of new startups in this space. We have new entire product categories, and not to just focus on products, but if we have more offerings, that means we're able to serve customers or asset owners in different ways. Which means yes, we do still have several frames of reference, but that also means we have different strategies now that we can execute. So it's not a one size fits all. It's not a, hey, invest in this security tool and it's a silver bullet. Now we're really seeing this convergence of, I don't want to call them point solutions because that kind of dismisses their usefulness, but you can actually build the right security program that works for you, that is affordable, that has your complexity and scope, and builds on some of the private sector brilliance, I think, in this space where it's not all about one solution or one category now, but you can go now and cherry pick and say, hey, year one, we're going to do a lot of work around our tabletop exercises and looking at, threat modeling. And year two, we're going to do this. And year three, we're going to do continuous monitoring. And year four, we're going to do that. And then you have continuous monitoring. You are able to sell up the chain, right, with your leadership on the complexity of the problem. And you're really fitting the solution to your needs rather than saying, hey, we have OT, so let's go buy an OT tool. Like that's not the space that we're in anymore. So I am optimistic about that. And, it's not a sales pitch, of course, for the private sector, but I did know about a couple of the startups before they were public. When they were in stealth, I was excited to be a part of those. I advised for a few still that I had been connected with prior to joining CISA. And then the last thing I'll say is, I don't know if this is out there, but I'm an adjunct at Dallas College and I teach intro to ICS cybersecurity. I'm actually also developing a course right now for Middlebury Institute in California. And it is all around, understanding the complexity of industrial control systems. But there's so much tenacity out there now. Like people are stoked about this topic. And I think that's really cool. So some of that education, we're going to start seeing more of the OT and ICS in some of the 4-year, cybersecurity programs. And that's something that, my seniors, the folks that were my mentors in this space have been asking for or pointing to as a gap for like 25 years. So I am optimistic.
That's fun that you're teaching. Are you seeing like a groundswell of interest in like OT specific learning at that level?
Yeah, absolutely. And it
awesome.
was missing before. So people were like, what is this course? What is this topic? And so a lot of times we see OT taught from a security perspective because people already have like a network security background. So they know how to use Wireshark, or they know how to do like packet analysis. That's one thing. And I think what's still missing is some of the like this is a process historian, this is how a car wash works. And some of that automation stuff that we see in the instrumentation world, like ISA world, that I was part of as well. I was chapter president for a while here. That's still missing from the cybersecurity conversation. So we always hear people say, like, you can train an engineer to do OT security, or you can train an IT person to do OT security. And so I'm trying to elevate some of the engineering background as well to make sure that they come in understanding, what a set point is, what a tag value is, how those things are changed, what those software applications do and don't do. And we still see companies, it's public, but I won't name this company, but we still see companies using like massive amounts of data in their historian applications for, like ESG reporting. And they still haven't retrofitted that to understand security and process data. But they have it. It's at the helm. They have it all there, but they're using it for different reporting mechanisms and not for security. And so I think there's also a huge potential there in the future to see
there's opportunity.
Data analytics across the board.
Yep. All right. Awesome. All right, Danielle, I think that's a good place to leave it. I really want to thank you so much for giving me the time and for coming on the show. I think this was a fun conversation.
Thank you. I was really excited to finally get on the Clarity podcast now that I'm not a competitor, and I really respect all of your episodes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, we'll definitely do another one down the road.
Excellent.
All right, bye-bye.